Communism and Nazism are the two greatest boogeymen in our modern century. When people think about communism, they think about Red Dawn or the Soviet troops invading, or they think about Chinese soldiers marching on American soil to invade. In the case of Nazism, people think about Nazi paratroopers marching in their Hugo Boss uniforms, or Captain America fighting the Red Skull, or if you play Call of Duty, you think about Nazi zombies. Although it is important to remember these things, these images still blind us from what was going on with these societies, the spirituality, or even the psychology of these ideologies. So let's not call it communism. We will call it international socialism, and let's not call it Nazism. Let's call it National Socialism. Now, with international socialism, we can already recognize the threat of this ideology just by its title. It's international. Its socialism cannot be within one border. It has to be international. And the premise of international socialism is the idea or belief that there are two fundamental groups, a good and a bad. Workers and capitalists, or in Marxist terms, it is the proletariats and the bourgeoisie. And the idea is that workers from nation to nation will rise, unite, arm themselves, and kill the capitalists because the workers can never do anything but be exploited, and the capitalists cannot do anything but exploit. There were many people around during the Cold War. Many people who were young around the time of the Cold War, they witnessed the psychology of paranoia. They saw two great superpowers, the United States and Soviet Russia. They saw two great superpowers who couldn't trust one another. They both had the nuclear atom bomb, and both were scared of who was going to launch it at who first. But when you hear the words international socialism, you can finally understand why the Soviets were such a threat. Their socialism is international. It cannot be limited within one's border. It has to be workers' uprisings to kill the capitalists and others in the process, and it has to be a worldwide phenomenon. We witnessed how bloody and horrific all the communist revolutions were all throughout Europe, Latin America, Asia, and Africa. And once they gain power, they seek to install a totalitarian state that seizes control and ownership over wealth, private property, etc. And this cannot be done in one country. It has to be global. You can see international socialism as the ideology of the sick because it spits on the greatness in society. It implies that the businessmen, the entrepreneurs, the innovators, the geniuses, the visionaries, and the CEOs are the monsters, but the only good people are the people with little to no money and just the basic skill and labor. It looks at the lowest denominator as the location of virtue, while attacking those that bring genius and inventions. It embraces the Untermensch. It celebrates poverty and human debility. And now, with National Socialism, you get the contrary to this. The National Socialists do not define themselves outside of their borders. They look within the borders. And so they came up with a myth of what makes them great. So let's look at the Nazis. Let's look at Nazi Germany. We know that the Nazis were a misguided movement. They had the whole Teutonic myth about how the German people were the chosen people, the best and most perfect people. But just like the International Socialists must attack the capitalists, the National Socialists must attack as well. Because it is not enough to make the claim, and not enough to say that the blonde-haired, blue-eyed Aryan race are the best people. Because Germany in the 1930s, they had just suffered the defeat of World War I. If you make the claim that the German people are the best, the question you must ask is, well, why aren't we the best? Why are we second place? Why is there so much poverty in Germany? And so the response isn't that we must keep working in ourselves and move forward to achieve an ideal. The response is to blame the failures on another group. And in the case of Germany, it was the Jews, the Gypsies, and the Slavs. Those people undermined us in World War I, they are at fault and they are evil. But now, the National Socialists did celebrate the positive ideals. They celebrated the visionaries, the accomplished athlete, the musician, and their racial and ethnic heritage. But they could only celebrate those ideals while hating another group. And just like the International Socialists create the conflict between workers and capitalists, National Socialists create a similar conflict. They must attack as well. It needs another group to blame all of its problems on. Both communism and National Socialism do not have an ideal to look towards. Both of these ideas are utopian. So they need a scapegoat for why we're not in those societies already. They both promise heaven on earth. They promise that once we kill all of the capitalists, and when we finally get rid of all the Jews, we will have a workers' paradise, or we will have a Reich that will last us 1,000 years. But the reality is, none of them have a solution. They have a couple of ideas, some that are bad, and some that might be good, but they don't have a solution. So that is why they push the evil of the world on a single group. It's nothing but a scapegoat. It's one goat you appoint all of the tribe's sins on, and sacrifice it to some false god. And now, there's a third ideology that came out of the 19th or 20th century, but it has existed for a very long time. And the third head of Cerberus is democracy. When people think about democracy, they think about two political parties, voting booths, and elections. So a better term for democracy should be Universal Socialism. Let's think of Universal Socialism within the context of American democracy. And just like the other systems, it needs to break things down into two simplistic groups, a good group and a bad group, of course. And in this case, within American democracy, we have a false left and right divide in American politics and paradigm in which everything has to conform with some Hegelian dialectic. One thing you will notice about the false right and left divide is how frequently policies switch back and forth between both of these groups. And here are some examples if you're interested in hearing them. Civil rights. Civil rights from the start was a Republican movement. Back in the 40s, the Democrats were the Union Party, and a lot of these unions didn't want to allow black members in because that sort of competition would have lowered the wages. And so the Democrats were supporting the unions. They were in favor of Jim Crow laws, whereas the Republicans that were representing business interests, they were for the removal of Jim Crow laws and pro-civil rights. But during the past 50 years, we have seen these policies switch. The Democratic Party decided to change their strategy in hopes to appeal to the black votes. And now the Democrats appeal to the black vote, and the Republicans are the ones who are supposedly a bunch of old racist white men. Then the recent example will be Obamacare. Obamacare originally started off as a policy passed out by the Republicans. They got together and made that document because if the Democrats ever got close to socializing medicine, they would propose Obamacare as a halfway solution, as an alternative that will still keep the private industry involved. And now we see how Obamacare is now a policy by the Democrats, and now we see that the Republicans now oppose it. And another recent example was how originally Republicans were opposed to gay marriage, even the Democrats once, but now they both support same-sex marriage, both of them. But however, there are some differences. Anonymous Conservative pointed this out in an excellent book. I recommend for anyone to read it. He pointed out the temperamental differences between both the Republicans and the Democrats. And he pointed out the fact that the Democrats tend to attract the rabbit people, and the right tends to attract the wolves. It's a bit more complicated than that. I recommend you guys to go read that book. But there are these two trends in the political party. But the political parties themselves and all these policies that we see swapping back and forth are nothing but a distracting sideshow to distract the mob. This isn't an Athenian democracy that failed in ancient Greece anyway. This is bread and circuses like we saw in the Roman Empire. The whole point of politics in a democracy is to distract the mob from the real issues. Just like the International Socialists will tell all the people that all of your problems, it's all those evil capitalists or that evil capitalism, all of that is destroying you. The Nazis told their people that the reason Germany was such a failure is because those Jews undermined us. And in democracy, they have their own oppositions within the political arena. Both political parties cannot understand the bigger picture. They can't think outside of the context of party politics. So they blame each other, but anyone with common sense and standards can see that these two parties are both globalist parties that sometimes enforce policies that go against our interests. All of these modern ideologies that are spawned, all three of them come down to socialism, not the economic principle of how much GDP should be spent on social programs, although there are crossovers with that. But socialism, in the sense of ideology of what it means to control people, of what it means to be a person, these ideologies must control the minds of all the citizens and control every aspect of our living. There is no higher purpose in any of these societies. The communists have the workers' utopia that has resulted in bloody totalitarian dictatorships. The Nazis had their Teutonic myth, which is just a pagan myth that should have died thousands of years ago. And then there's progressivism in the West. And nobody knows what progress is, not even the progressives. And if you predict what the progressives will do in the next few years, and you have to predict it accurately, they will call you unhinged or mentally ill or accuse you of engaging in a slippery slope fallacy. These societies ignore human virtue, nature, and ignore the purpose for our existence. Maybe humans are all stupid and need a scapegoat, and maybe we do need to kill off the wrong type of enemies and go to all these pointless wars. But maybe, you know what? Maybe I'm an optimist and believe that we can do better. And I believe we really can do better. Stay righteous, folks. Blaze out.